Well, good to be with all of you again. We are starting the second section of the course, which means that in terms of testing, you can now not worry about the things that we covered in the first section. We are leaving that material behind. It does nothing more for us from this point forward than provide the foundation for studying new materials. So we're starting with chapter 22, talking about the progressive era at the very end of the 19th and the dawn of the 20th century. This is a place in the book where we begin to get some overlap because a lot of the movement that is going to happen in the progressive era is going to be a result of politics. And so when we talk about the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and and Woodrow Wilson, we are going to deal with a lot of progressive legislation, a lot of progressive issues. This is where most of your progress is going to be made. So all we're really going to kind of do in this chapter with this lecture is to paint the broad picture of what progressivism was, why did it show up, when did it show up, how did it get started, what were the sort of unifying principles of various progressive movements, what were some of its more notable achievements that we aren't going to be talking about later, how did it alter especially government, and what were some of the darker undersides of progressivism. So why does the progressive movement come about? Well, it really is a force that is unleashed consequent of the second industrial revolution. So America has been changing at an ever-increasing rate since the end of the Civil War. New cities have been born, new industries have arisen, new styles of industrial organization, vertical integration, monopolies, aka trusts, these sorts of things have been given birth. You've had the rise of the robber barons. You've had an economy that has been increasingly moving from being a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy. You've had millions of immigrants pour into the country. Lots of country people leave rural America, come to the cities, come to the towns to find work, and as a consequence, the nature of work had changed. People were working for someone else now. They had to show up on time. They got off work at a certain time. Their lives were governed more by the clock, and industrial labor was very different than agricultural labor in many fundamental ways. There were also new technologies, things that had made life easier, more interesting. The telephone has been invented. The record player has been invented. The light bulb has been invented and perfected. The typewriter showed up. The automobile and even the airplane has come onto the scene with those first flights by the Wright brothers in North Carolina, those first powered flights in North Carolina. So you have some emerging technologies like the automobile and the aircraft. You have some old technologies like the railroads that are becoming more pervasive, more innovative, more sophisticated, with greater capabilities. All of this has produced millions and millions of jobs. It has made the country extremely wealthy. It has made it the world's economic powerhouse in many ways. And all of that, of course, has produced enormous overseas trade that has haltingly at least entered America into the ranks of world powers, even if at this point it's a relatively minor world power with a very tiny island empire stretching across the Pacific and into the Caribbean. But nonetheless, the United States is now a global player of some sort. And all of this, of course, has had a profound impact on daily life. So the fabric of living has changed in many ways. More and more people are going to grocery stores to buy their food instead of growing it themselves. More and more people are tied to industries that service increasingly national and sometimes global economies and markets rather than regional and statewide economies, these sorts of things. You've had this change happen that has fundamentally altered the way people traveled, the way they communicated, the way they worked, the way that they viewed the world, they viewed their place in it. And many of these changes were very good. They made life better. They made life more interesting. They made life easier. They made life safer. But of course, some of these changes were not good. You had the rise of the labor unions in response to unhappiness with the working conditions, which were harsh. Hours were long. Safety measures were non-existent. The power that the robber barons held and the factory managers held over the lives of ordinary people was often seen to be abusive and unfair and trampling upon the dignity of individuals as well. And of course, the rise of cities always comes with certain negative aspects, and so there was corruption, there was pollution, there were slums, there were gangs. These are not modern 20th or 21st century inventions. These things have always existed where you've had large groups of people congregate together. And of course you have the old evils, alcoholism and prostitution and gambling and all sorts of other vices and these sorts of things. And so the two sides to the coin is something you're going to hear me say all the time. The Second Industrial Revolution produced a lot of good. It also produced a lot of bad. The robber barons produced some good and they produced some bad. The changes that had occurred in the second half of the 19th century produced good for America, and they also produced problems for America. You would solve some old issues like how to integrate the country into a single economy, how to overcome vast distances and mountain ranges and these sorts of things, but you'd created new problems at the same time. The old way of living had been relatively slow. Now you have a way of living that is relatively fast-paced. By modern standards, not fast-paced at all, but by the standards of the people at the time, this was a dizzying change, and this change had happened in a remarkably short period of time. Imagine this. You could have had somebody who was born in, say, 1830, just as the railroads were coming onto the scene, as the steamboat was becoming prominent, and the telegraph had appeared as a new and faster means of communication, and they could have died at the age of 70 or 75 in a world in which there were automobiles, in which there were submarines, in which there were airplanes, in which you could get on something called the telephone in New York City and talk almost instantly to somebody on the other side of a continent in San Francisco. I mean, the change was of a pace that was really exciting in some ways and disruptive in many, many other ways. And as change always does, it had benefited some people and hurt other people. And it was the growing disparity between those who benefited and those who were hurt, the growing disparity in wealth between people like the robber barons and the workers in their factories, that is going to create dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction that is going to make people question whether or not we cannot do things better. And if we cannot make America a safer place to live in, a safer place to work in, a more efficient society, more scientific society. Science was something that was really upheld by Americans during this period. Science was perceived to have given the country all of these great advantages. And remember, science is investigatory. It is the discovery. It is taking the science and turning it into useful products that we call technology. But nonetheless, there had been such a flood of technology based on so many scientific discoveries that people believed that the scientific method was really the key to providing prosperity. It was the key to providing equality. It was the key to providing better government. It was the key to a better society, a better humanity, that we could make society work in a more orderly and efficient way, and we could diagnose its ills and then come up with cures. And so this idea of the scientific method is something that's really going to appeal to progressives. And now the spirit, this thing called progressivism is really kind of vague. Progressivism is not a political movement. per se. It is not purely a social movement per se. It is not exactly completely a reform movement. It is not the creature of any political party. You will find Democratic progressives, you will find Republican progressives. It doesn't belong to a particular part of the country. There were progressives will be found north, south, east, and west. They will be immigrant, they will be native born, they will be white, they will be black, they will be Hispanic, they will be Catholic, they will be Protestant, they will be male, they will be female. In other words, the spirit of progressivism is something that is going to be taken up by large segments of American society. But all of these people who would call themselves progressives or say that they believed in progressivism or would pursue elements of a progressive agenda are not part of a single organization. You didn't go somewhere and join the progressive movement. There were no dues, there were no membership forms, there was no chain of command, all that kind of stuff. So this is something that is really kind of broadcast throughout the land, and it's going to consist of an individual ethos, in a way. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of believing, but it's also going to be made up of hundreds of different organizations pursuing different goals in different ways, and collectively that adds up to the progressive movement, but it is not a hierarchical, it is not a well-organized or organized in any way kind of massive national movement. Now, that said, there are certain things that progressives are going to have in common, no matter on what level of society they worked, no matter what ills of society they attacked, no matter what their agendas were, progressives are going to have some things in common. And one of the things that they're going to have in common is a belief in the scientific method. So the scientific method that says we're going to solve society's problems, whether it be pollution, corruption, poverty, whatever it is. We're going to solve society's problems through the scientific method. And what does the scientific method do? Scientific method identifies something that it wants to study. And once it identifies what it wants to study, in this instance, we're going to say it's going to study particular problems. We're going to study poverty. Or in the slums of a big northeastern city like New York or something. So this is a problem. We want to solve it. So how are we going to go about that? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up with a thesis. So why do we think that there is so much disease in the slums of a big eastern city? And so we hypothesize that, it could be because people there are not getting enough sunlight and enough fresh air. And so we have a thesis, we have a theory, and then we go out to collect data. We make observations, we gather data, we analyze it, we collate it, and then from that we look at it and we say, okay, is there something here that would allow us then to verify the thesis? If we think there is, then we begin to experiment with solutions to it. So trial and error. So we think, okay, we need to build buildings that will allow people to get more fresh air, will get more sunlight, and we'll try that, and then we'll collect more data and we'll analyze it. If it doesn't work, then we can cross that off. Okay, that's not what's causing high incidences of disease in the slums. So, that's what the data tells us. Now let's come up with a different thesis. Maybe we need to have sewers that carry away wastewater and that sort of thing. So we'll collect data, we'll try that, and we'll collect data again, and we'll see how well it works. And so this business of the scientific method was something that pretty much all progressive movements are going to believe in. You want to base this not on emotion, you want to base this on hard facts. You want to base this on cold analysis. And in the way that science had developed technology, you want to use science to help solve society's problems. So a belief in the scientific method was something that all progressive movements are going to share. The other thing that all progressive movements are going to share is an ethos, a basic belief that it is necessary and that it is possible, it is within the realm of human power to make the world a better place, a safer place, a fairer place, a more just place, a more equitable place. And so you believe that. You believe we can do that. And how do we do that? We apply the scientific method to isolate the problems, analyze the problems, attempt to solve the problems, and we don't get hung up on whether or not our solutions work or not. We say, we try something and it doesn't work. We say, well, that's not it. We try something else. We keep trying something until we solve the problem. We don't, reach our conclusions and go with say like, well, of course there's a lot of disease in the slums. Look who lives there. The poor people live there. The immigrants live there. They're dirty people. Their habits of life are bad. They're natural incubators of disease, and so the reason you have disease in the slums is because of the people who live there. That's an ideological approach, okay, to the problem. The scientific method would reject that. Progressive would reject that. So no, we're not going to believe that. We think that all people are not born inherently good or evil, prone to obey the law or break the law. They're not prone to be alcoholics or sober, that kind of thing. That environment impacts people more than anything else, and therefore we're going to look at environmental reasons why we have problems, and we're going to analyze them, we're going to solve them that way. So this belief that you can make things better, and you can do that through the scientific method. These are traits that all progressive organizations are going to share. Another thing that is going to be a common element of progressivism is its leadership. Its leadership. By and large, progressive movements were organized, they were run, and they were mostly populated by a young, well-educated, affluent middle class. So this is one of the things that the Second Industrial Revolution has created. It's created all kinds of new career fields. It's vastly expanded colleges and universities, educational opportunities. More and more people are working in offices, in universities, and that kind of stuff, and they're not out in the fields, or they're not in the factories, working 60 hours a week, sun up to sundown, hard, exhausting work from which you come home and all you want to do is rest and get something to eat and then go to sleep because you got to get up the next morning and do it again. Physical labor is much more exhausting than mental labor. And so what you had is the creation of a middle class. That had gone to college, had gone to university, that had education, that could read, and that had money, they had wealth. So they lived fairly comfortably in these new towns and these new cities where they could have access to all these new technologies. This was kind of a first in American society. A middle class as we would sort of understand it today. There'd always been rich and there'd always been poor, and there'd always been a middle, but the difference between the middle and the poor and the rich in the first centuries of American history really hadn't been that great. Everybody was still working the land, involved in agriculture and this sort of thing. But the Second Industrial Revolution has changed that. And so you have this young, well-educated, affluent middle class who comes home at the end of a workday not completely worn out and exhausted. They're not going to work on weekends. These are people who have the ability to tap into all the new technologies that makes life much easier, and that gives them something that most people throughout history had never had, and that was leisure time. Leisure time. Time where they weren't exhausted, that they had free to do something they wanted to do, not something they had to do, not something that was involved in the simple act of survival. They had time to pursue leisurely activities, and there were just the beginnings of professional sports like baseball, and the movie theaters haven't shown up yet, radio hasn't shown up yet, so leisure activities were kind of hard to come by. You could go to plays and you could go to fairs and this sort of thing, but one of the things that people did was they formed organizations, they formed societies, book clubs and debating clubs and lyceums and these sorts of things, and they would get together for fun to talk about the great issues of the day, to delve into intellectual topics and this sort of thing. And as they gathered together to do this with one another, they had this kind of vague idea that the world was not as good for everybody in America as it was for them. They had this sense that they were doing better than people had ever done before, but there were lots of people who had not attained that same status. So they have this kind of idea that everything is not right. That one of the phrases that is used to describe this part of history is the Gilded Age, the Gilded Age. And that it's a very evocative phrase, because if something is gilded, it means it looks like it's made out of a precious metal, but in fact it's not. It's just got a light surface cover of that precious metal, and underneath is a very base, very ordinary kind of metal. So let's say you go to a dollar store and you buy what's called a brass lamp, right? And is that lamp really made out of brass? And the answer is no, because brass is expensive, and you're not going to find a brass lamp at a dollar store. It looks like brass, the color is brass, but what you've got is the thin coating of a material that makes it look like brass. And if you get out a pocket knife and you start to scrape it, the brass is going to go away very quickly, and you're going to find out that it's aluminum or something like that. It's the difference between a real diamond and a cubic zirconia or something. It looks like a diamond, but it's not actually a diamond. And so the Gilded Age, America seemed on the surface to be, prospering, to be jumping forward technologically, life getting better for everybody, but that wasn't true. There were people who were being ground down by this new industrial economy, who were the workers who were really making it go, but were not enjoying the benefits of it, and who were suffering in many ways. And so Gilded Age, and this young, well-educated, fluent middle class in their book clubs and their debating societies kind of had the sense of that, the idea of that, but they didn't see it. They weren't exposed to it. It's just like that there's crime in your city, and that there are parts of the city where there's more crime than others, and you hear the news stories, you see it on TV, or you read about it in the newspaper, but unless you go to those parts of your city, or you live in those parts of your city, you don't have direct experience with it. So you intellectually know that there are dangerous neighborhoods where there's a lot of crime or a lot of drugs or something like that, but it's not your personal experience. And if it's not your personal experience, then it's really easy to kind of forget about it, to just file it away. There's no sense of need to do anything about it. It's not a direct impact on your life. And so this is one of the sensations that this young, affluent, well-educated middle class have. The other one is a sense that their lives had no real purpose, no great mission. And when they compare themselves to previous generations, that seemed especially problematic. After all, their great-grandparents had created the country. They'd fought the revolution. They'd written the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. And then there was the pioneer generation that had settled the country, that had settled all the way to the Mississippi and then settled all the way to the Pacific. And then there were the generation, their father's generation, that had fought the Civil War, that had saved the Union, that had freed the slaves. These generations had made profound impact, and they created the country. They had discovered the raw materials. They had begun to build the industries that generated the wealth that this young, well-educated, affluent middle class was now enjoying. But that left this group of people with the question, what is our generation going to do? What's our generation going to do? What's our contribution going to be? There wasn't something obvious on the horizon, right? There wasn't save the Union. It wasn't create an independent country. It wasn't settle the West or something like that. This is a profound question, kind of like, why am I here? Why are we here? That every sentient being sooner or later asks, what is the purpose of life? And they looked around and they said, well, we're doing very well. We're comfortable. We're taking care of our children. We're doing good things in communities, supporting churches and building libraries and funding charities and this sort of stuff. We're enjoying all these new technologies. We're living well, but is that the purpose? Is the purpose of life just to have fun? Is the purpose of life just to acquire a lot of things? Is that what you want on your tombstone at the end of your life? Is, here lies Joe. He had a really killer game system. Is that what you want to be remembered by? And of course, most people would tell you no. They want to make a difference in the world. They want history to remember that they were here, at least that their generation was here. And it manage to accomplish something, move humanity forward. But having this sense that we lack a mission, having this sense that not everything is as good for all Americans as it is for us, all of that just left them this sort of vague sense that things weren't quite right, and that they really wish that they had a purpose that they could pursue that would put them on par with what their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents had done. This young, well-educated middle class, therefore, is positioned to become the leadership of the progressive movement. They have the education, they have the time, they have this need to find a mission, they have this need to contribute, they have this need to try and help the people who haven't done as well by the new industrial economy as they have. And so they're going to be the leaders, right? But what's going to spark their movement? What is it that's going to connect to this time, this leisure, this education, this need for mission, this sense that everything's not right, to actually taking action? And the thing that's going to spark it is journalism. So in the same way that journalism, yellow journalism, helped to give us the Spanish-American War, we're going to have a style of journalism that's going to help to give us the progressive movement. And this style of journalism is called muckraking, M-U-C-K-R-A-K-I-N-G, like going out in a barnyard with a rake and dredging up the dirt. It looks nice and dry on the surface, but when you begin to churn it up underneath, you find that it's wet and it's smelly and it's ugly and this sort of thing. And so muckraking is a very evocative phrase. Today, we would call muckraking more something along the lines of investigative journalism, at least ideal investigative journalism that goes out and spends a lot of time working very hard to dig below the surface, to find out what's going on behind the scenes, to pull back the curtain, if you will. And the muckrakers and yellow journalists are alike in this way, that they sensationalize things. The whole purpose here is to sell magazines, it's to sell newspapers, it's to increase circulation, to increase subscription rates so that your paper or your magazine can charge advertisers ever more money to put their ads before more and more readers. So in that sense, you have a lot of similarity between yellow journalists and muckrakers. They're going to write their stories in sensationalistic ways possible. They're also going to have an agenda. The yellow journalists definitely seem to have an agenda to get the United States involved in the war in Cuba, to convince the American people and the American government to support the Cuban insurrectos in their battle against Spanish colonial oppression. The muckrakers are going to have a mission too. They're going to have a purpose. They're going to want to expose the underbelly of this new industrial economy, the underside of the second industrial revolution. They're going to put up basically a great big flashing neon sign to point this young, well-educated middle class toward the problems that they sense are there, but they haven't actually had to cope with, they haven't actually personally interacted with. And once this great big flashing sign is pointing at the problems that are underneath the new industrial urban America, the muckrakers are basically going to look at the young middle class and say, okay, you wanted a mission? You want a place to use your talents to make the world better, to help more Americans share in the benefits of the new technological age? Solve these problems. Go after these evils. And so it is journalism that is going to connect the leadership of the progressive movement to the problems that the progressive movement are going to try and solve. And so muckraking is going to be all important in this endeavor. And it begins to get itself really going. I mean, the idea of progressivism is sort of born in the last decade or so of the 19th century. And you can see it swirling around in the labor movement, a desire to combat corruption in politics, a desire to treat workers better in factories and mills and railroad yards. That's all going to kind of be consumed, brought into the progressive movement, which is going to now have a broader brush that it is going to paint with. And so this thing really begins to take off in 1902. Well, a very well-known magazine called McClure's ran an article about political corruption in St. Louis. And so every major city was run by a party machine. Most of them, Republican and Democrat, they both did it. Most of them manipulated the electoral system to ensure that they stayed in power. They took care of their friends, they punished their enemies, and although people were actually getting to go and vote, the elections were not always fairly conducted. There was a lot of bribery, there was a lot of corruption, and everybody kind of knew that this was what was going on, but it was sort of hidden. It was there. You didn't have to think about it all the time. You didn't directly confront it. Maybe, it was like crime somewhere in your city. You shoved it off into the corner of your brain. But here, for the first time, you had a major national magazine dig into corruption in a major American city, and to lay it all out there, to put it in print, exactly how this is done, who's doing it, and to sort of, to dig up the dirt, to rake the muck, and lay all the sore details out in front of you. And so this is kind of shocking, and it was a sensation, and that issue of the magazine sold very well. And so in its next issue, McClure's began the serial publication of a book by Ida Tarbell called The History of the Standard Oil Trust. Now, this is the way that a lot of books were published in that day and age. Printing was expensive, and so you usually didn't, as a publisher, run the risk of saying, oh, here's a manuscript, people will buy this as a book, we'll print it all up and we'll send it out there. There were, of course, some things that you knew you could sell and you would do that way, but other things you ran as serial, S-E-R-I-A-L, in a series of magazines or newspapers, so that, people would kind of get hooked on it and start to read it, and then eventually you would put all the articles together in the form of a single book. And of course, Standard Oil was a nationwide, in fact, a worldwide industry. John D. Rockefeller's oil empire was something that actually touched everybody's life one way or another. And now you find out how John D. Rockefeller built that empire, the good and the bad, the espionage, the sabotage, the political favors, and the brutalizing of competitors and these sorts of things. And so this was all laid out there. And then there was another article about political corruption called The Shame of Minneapolis, and all of this caught the public's eye. And McClure's was selling copies of its magazines left and right, and other magazines and other newspapers took note, and they mimicked what McClure's was doing. So between 1903 and 1909, you had the muckrakers, or these investigative journalists, if you prefer, go out and investigate things like corruption and injustice, the conditions in the slum, deceptive business practices, corrupt bargains, the abuses of the trust and the monopolies, and the way that they mistreated their customers, and the way that they manipulated the politicians, civil rights abuses, the horrors of unhealthy and unsafe and unfair factory conditions, and the poverty in the slums, and these sorts of things. And all of that, of course, was shocking to people. It was the first time they were having those facts laid out in front of them. It wasn't just a vague sensation. Yeah, I know what's going on. All politicians are corrupt. All cities are run corruptly. The robber barons have a lot of unchecked power. Now you were humanizing that. You were putting it on paper, and you were basically showing people how the corrupt sausage was made, and that repulsed a lot of people. They were outraged by it. They wanted a country. They believed that they lived in a country when everybody would be treated fairly, everybody would be the same before the law, everybody would have dignity, everybody would try to be fair and to be kind to their fellow man, where the politicians were there to do the bidding of the people and to look out for the interest of the people. And they found out that no, that is not completely the way that it worked, that those ideas were not being lived up to all the time or everywhere. And this is endemic to to the human condition. Human beings, human civilizations, human societies are like that. This is not unique to America by any stretch of the imagination, nor was it unique to America at the end of the 19th or the dawn of the 20th century. You go back through history and you will find these problems are endemic to the human condition. Every culture, every age, you're going to find problems like this. But what happens now is because the muckrakers are exposing all of this, they've given that young, well-educated, affluent middle class a mission, and they are going to take up that mission. Not in a consolidated, concentrated way. They're going to go to work. In the local level, the state level, the national level, they're going to attack all kinds of evils and ills. Some of them are going to go after corruption in government. Some are going to go after the poverty of the slums. Some of them are going to go after civil rights abuses. Some of them are going to attack, age-old problems like alcoholism. Some of them are going to strike back against the power of the robber barons and the trusts and the way that they're manipulating the economy and manipulating the government and these sorts of things. And so it's going to all equal a vast movement that is primarily aimed at reform to make the world a bigger and better place. But there is going to be an underside of all of this too, as we are going to see and discuss. Nonetheless, the progressive movement is going to have a very profound impact. And again, we're going to talk about some of this when we get into the presidencies, particularly of Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. But I want to touch on a few big things here to kind of highlight the importance of the progressive movement, the impact that it has. And one of the things of note about the progressive movement is it's going to produce 3 constitutional amendments. 3 amendments to the Constitution are going to be spawned by the progressive movement. And that's something. You can find only one other instance in American history where an event gives you 3 amendments to the Constitution, and that is the American Civil War, but gives you the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Before that, you have to go back to the actual adoption of the Constitution, after which we put the Bill of Rights in, 10 amendments. But beyond that moment and the Civil War, you cannot find another instance in American history where a certain period, a certain political movement gives you that many constitutional amendments that quickly, and the progressives certainly did that. So that speaks to their effectiveness. There were 3 constitutional amendments that the progressives are going to get through, and the first of these is the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment, the 16th Amendment, by the way, provides for a federal income tax. That was, one of the ways that you're going to try and fund the government, but it's not. That's not a progressive measure. The 17th Amendment, though, is, because one of the things that progressives believed is that the electoral process was being corrupted by robber barons, by the wealthy who could afford to, in essence, bribe politicians, if not directly bribe them with offers of campaign contributions, kickbacks, favors to family and friends, and these sorts of things. And because this could happen, then it was impossible many times to get legislation passed that would benefit the public, that would benefit workers, that would curb the power of the robber barons and the trusts, the monopolies, and that sort of thing. And this was true on the state level, but it was also true on the national level. So we remember that the way that the U.S. Constitution was originally created, the way it was originally written, is that you have direct representation in the lower house of Congress, or the House of Representatives, that word, representative, and every state gets a number of representatives in proportion to its population, and the people directly vote on these representatives every 2 years. The entire House is up for re-election. The Senate, however, was designed to be a more consistent and deliberative body. Every state got 2 senators. Those senators were elected by state legislators. Senators get a 6-year term. Only 1/3 of the Senate stands for election every 2 years. And the idea, as the Founding Fathers had originally envisioned it, was that the House and the Senate are going to counterbalance each other. That the House is where the people have their say, but the Founding Fathers, living in an age when most people were illiterate, they were uneducated, the Founding Fathers were nervous about pure democracy, fearing that pure democracy could become mob democracy, that people would be impassioned, and movements would take over, and people would be attacked for their beliefs, and they would be shouted down, and literally, a handful of people could get everybody all excited and all worked up about something, and there would be this movement to do something that maybe was not a smart thing to do, maybe was not a wise thing to do, maybe things that deserved to be considered calmly with great reflection and great study before action was taken. This is what the House could potentially get you. And so the Senate was supposed to be immune to that because the senators had longer terms. They were not elected directly by the people. They would be able to take that long view. They would be able to take the time to consider, to investigate, to deliberate, because remember, you can't get a law to the president's desk for signature or veto unless exactly the same version of that legislation is passed by the House and the Senate. So as the Founding Fathers ingeniously invented the system, there are all these checks and balances. The Congress passes laws, the president gets to sign or veto, but the Congress can override a presidential veto. The Supreme Court can declare a law signed by a president, passed by Congress, to be unconstitutional. The House can block the Senate can block the House. It's a recipe to actually not get a lot of big stuff done unless there is a broad and general consensus. The Founding Fathers did not want a system where one sliver of the society, the body politic, could jam its will down the throat of another. They wanted to force the politicians to work together and to compromise with each other. And a Senate that represented the states and was elected directly by the people was one of the ways that you were going to ensure that could happen. The difficulty, as a lot of progressives saw it, was that since state legislators elected the United States Senate, state legislators were therefore vulnerable to being corrupted by the power, the prestige, the money of the robber barons and the elites and that kind of thing, and they could, in essence, corrupt a bunch of state legislators, make sure that they elected people to the U.S. Senate who would be just inclined to do, or more often not do, the kinds of things that the robber barons and the great trusts and monopolies wanted done, and therefore the will of the people was being subverted. And so the answer to that was an amendment to the Constitution, the 17th Amendment, that provides for the direct election of U.S. senators. So the 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of U.S. senators. They are now elected very similar to how the House is elected. So with the House, you have congressional districts. So, small parts of every state that have a congressman. Senators are statewide offices, so everybody in the state votes for a senator, but now the people directly elect the Senate. And the idea here is that that means that those senators are going to be beholden to the people, and not beholden to the state legislators, who could be beholden to the robber barons or the political elites or something like that. As is always the case, the theory doesn't necessarily meet the reality. A solution will cause often as many problems as it will solve, and you therefore dramatically change a fundamental part of the structure of the U.S. Constitution as it had been intended. But nonetheless, this is something progressives got done. This is huge, changing the way that you elect half of the United States Congress. The other thing that the progressives are going to manage to do is to give the U.S. government the power to enact prohibition, that is, to ban the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. And so this harkens back to the old temperance movement in the 1820s, during the first wave of industrialization, when you had a movement to get rid of the booze. And you get rid of the booze because liquor leads to alcoholism, which leads to all sorts of other problems, families abandoned, spouses and children abused, and eventually, of course, all sorts of health problems, and liquor feeds other vices like prostitution, gambling, vice, corruption, these sorts of things. How do you get rid of a lot of those problems? Well, you remove their source, and liquor is the source. And so this had been debated for a very long time in American history, and now the progressives are going to get it done. The 18th Amendment gives the U.S. government the power to establish prohibition. Now, the 18th Amendment doesn't establish prohibition. Okay, it just says Congress will have the power to do it, and Congress will do it. It will pass something called the Volstead Act in 1920 that's going to ban the manufacture, sale, transportation of anything that has more than 1% alcohol in its content. As we will see when we get there, there are going to be lots of loopholes in that, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Liquor was too much a part of American culture, too much a part of the American way of life, and what is actually going to happen is people aren't going to stop using booze. They're just going to use it illegally, and it's going to let criminals, take over the trade and these sorts of things. So the 18th Amendment is going to be the only one that's ever repealed. It's going to be the only amendment ever put into the Constitution that's then later going to be taken out. But that is sort of beyond the brief at this moment. What we want to point out is that here is something that reformers had tried to get done since the 1820s. And it is the progressives who are going to get it done at the end of the 19-teens. So, indicative of the huge impact that they have. Another thing that the progressives are going to do that has perhaps the biggest impact of all, and one that will resonate forever in American politics, is to give suffrage to women. That is, to give women the right to vote. So we had already touched on this. It was up to the states to decide who was eligible to vote, and except for a handful of very new Western states, the state governments were willing to deny women the right to vote. And there was a lot of opposition to the idea of giving women the right to vote, but the progressives believe women should have the suffrage. And it's interesting because this is not one of the primary goals of the progressive movement, sort of when it kicks off, when it gets going, but it becomes an important element of the progressive movement because there were a lot of women who were active in progressive causes. Women, as much as men, were drivers of the progressive movement. And the problem that creates for progressives is that a lot of what they want to get done has to revolve around getting politicians to do things, to pass laws, to make regulations, and this sort of stuff. And if a large part of your membership can't vote, well, then that weakens the willingness of politicians to pay attention to you. Politicians pay attention to people who vote. And if you have a lot of women in your organization, they can't vote, the politicians say, well, yeah, they can pay lip service to you and they can pander to you and that kind of thing, but at the end of the day, they say that this organization can't hurt me if I don't do what it wants, if I don't listen to it. And so giving women the right to vote was actually a way for the progressives to exercise more clout. Now, there was a lot of resistance to this, and those who opposed it and those who supported it were kind of mirror images of each other. So those who opposed giving women the right to vote started off with hey, they've never had the right to vote. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've done just fine without women voting. Why should we want to change that? The Catholic Church was very opposed to giving women the right to vote because they believed that women should not be involved in politics. And this was something that was echoed across this segment of society because politics was not just the realm of men. Okay, and leadership was not just the realm of men as they saw it. Politics is corrupting. Anybody who gets involved in politics somehow, some way is going to get sullied by it, is going to get corrupted by it. It's just the nature of politics. It's a rough and tumble, mean, dirty, ugly business, and women don't belong there because women are honest, and women are pure, and women are good, and they are the repositories of those virtues in society. And if society values those virtues, which in a way you're saying it's men are already a hopeless cause, they can't hold on and maintain those virtues in society. That's women's job. If you let women get involved in politics, then there goes virtue, there goes honesty and truth and purity in the society as a whole. That will all become corrupted. And then you had, of course, the liquor industry and the saloon industry that didn't want women to have the right to vote, because they believed that one of the first things that would happen when women got the right to vote is that you would get prohibition. And they're not going to be wrong about that, not going to be wrong about that at all. But then there's the flip side that says maybe we do need to have prohibition, so that's a reason to give women the right to vote. There were a lot of Protestant Americans who didn't like the Catholic Church, so if the Catholic Church was against something, then maybe they were naturally inclined to be for it. You could point to those handful of Western states where women were allowed to vote and say, well, society hasn't collapsed. That it hasn't turned out to be an unworkable thing. And then there's what I guess we could say sort of a sexist argument in favor of giving women the right to vote, because you agree women are the repositories of all of society's special values. They are honest, they are good, they are pure, they are caring, they are giving, and these sorts of things. But that is precisely why we want women to vote, because they will bring those values with them into the voting booth, and we will get better leaders, and we will get better government, we will get a better America out of it. And isn't that what we all want? And at the end of the day, just the fundamental question, are you going to deny 50% of the population the right to vote? If women could be your teachers, they could be your nurses, they could be your mothers, they could raise you up and impart the moral code to you and all that kind of, why is it that you would not let them vote? But this is part of change, and change is often resisted. Change opens doors that can be good and it can be bad, and therefore change makes people afraid, and they will push back, and not all change is good, but here unquestionably was a change that was not going to be denied. And so you got the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that gives women the right to vote. And of course this is going to fundamentally change the American electorate, and not so much here in the first half of the 20th century, but certainly in the second half of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st century. The fact that women vote is a profound influence on American politics and American electoral campaigns and these sorts of things. So those three amendments, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, are huge progressive wins. Progressives did other things. For example, they really pushed hard to make government more responsive to people, to make government more efficient. So thanks to progressives, you begin to wrest the power to run cities away from these political party machines. You took the power away from mayors who could sort of lord it over their city however wanted. You began to create urban leagues that were concerned citizens who organized together to push for civic reform and better services from the city. You began to inject professionalism into government. Remember, progressives are well educated and affluent, and therefore they think highly of the role that education has in preparing people for certain jobs. And so now they wanted experts, people who were trained to run fire departments, to be fire chiefs, people who were trained to be police officers, to be police chiefs. So they wanted people who were trained engineers to be in charge of building roads and bridges and maintaining them, and not giving those jobs to political appointees or political hacks or something like this. The concept of city managers is born during the progressive era. So you elect the politicians to do the political stuff in the city, but now you're going to hire a city manager, somebody who's trained, who has degree in understanding how to do budgets and how to manage police and fire departments and to build roads and to deal with sanitation and these sorts of things. They're going to bring that scientific expertise in to the job, and they're not going to be influenced by, hey, what neighborhoods are voting for me, what neighborhoods are voting against me. They're going to, treat all the neighborhoods the same. They're going to do this on a scientific principle. Another thing that progressives did in a lot of states was to get constitutions changed, state constitutions changed, to enable people to both start a legislative process and to bypass state legislatures to approve legislation. So the first of these is initiative, which literally means that the public can initiate legislation. So let's say that the public wants a bill passed that says school buses have to stop when they come to railroad crossings. But for some reason, the state legislature's got no interest in doing that, whatsoever. Obviously, I'm making up a farcical example here, but so let's say that you want a law, the public believes there ought to be a law, but the legislature's not willing to take it up for any reason. Prohibition, maybe, would be a better example. And so if you have a state constitution that permits initiative, then what the citizenry can do is start a petition. Start a petition to propose legislation, and enough people sign that petition, then the legislative body has to take it up. The people initiate the process, and the legislative body has to take it up. But of course, the legislative body could take it up and still reject it. So you have referendum, and referendum allows the people themselves to approve or reject legislation. So instead of just initiating it and say, okay, now you have to deal with it, you have a petition sign that says, we're going to put a law establishing prohibition on the ballot. We're not going to let the state government decide. We're going to let the people decide at the ballot box. And so there is a referendum, and people can vote for or against legislation. And you take the representative governing body, you take the politicians completely out of the process. And of course, initiative and referendum do tend to make government more responsive to the will of the people, but again, sometimes that happens with unintended consequences. So you can have a referendum that says, hey, let's cut property taxes. Yay, everybody wants their property taxes cut, and so it passes overwhelmingly, but then you have an enormous shortfall in the state budget. You're not bringing in as much revenue, and you've given a new problem to the legislature, and they're going to have to start cutting, services and that kind of thing to make up for that budget shortfall. So again, sometimes direct democracy does not lead to well thought out, carefully considered, balancing pros and cons democracy, but it certainly makes the people more capable of influencing the direction of public policy, and this was something that progressives believed in. Progressives also worked hard to change the legal system and the educational system. So progressives, managed to get court cases approved. They attack or defend certain laws successfully on the basis of not just what the law says. There's the law say that a business can do this or that the government can do that. Progressives inject into the jurisprudence now the impact of laws is, if this is unprecedented, then you can't do it. That's a straightforward, legal position. But if the purpose of the law is good, if the benefit is good, or if the evil that we're attacking deserves to be attacked, then that gets to be considered too. So not just the strict legal precedents, what's written in the law books, but the motivations, the purposes behind laws now get to come into play. And that allows government to do things like say, hey, we're going to limit the number of hours that a woman can work. We think that women working 60 hours a week is bad. We think that it's a corrupting influence on women, and we want to limit their hours to 40 a week. Well, in a strict technical sense, the government ought to not have the ability to limit the number of hours that somebody works whatsoever. That's between you and your employer, right? For some women, maybe working 60 hours a week, something they want to do. Maybe it's something they financially need to do. But the progressives came in and defended that law and defended it successfully, saying, well, the impact of the law is what matters. And we can't have women being corrupted by the 60-hour work week, and it's bad for their morality and their families and these sorts of things. And that has nothing to do with the right of a person to, in essence, sell their labor, and has nothing to do with the right of a business to hire labor. This is government getting to say, this is what we think is right. This is what we think is moral. This is what we think is for the good of these people. And that is a very fundamentally different kind of way of looking at the law. Progressives also begin to really push for free public schooling and to change it from the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, that were taught often in a way that the progressives considered to be moral indoctrination. So if Johnny steals 5 apples and he goes to jail for 1 year for every apple he steals, how many years does he go to jail? Well, it's a math problem, right? So he goes to jail for 5 years. But also, what are you teaching? You're teaching steal apples, get caught, go to jail. Progressives believe that education should be about opening minds. It should be about inspiring young people to seek out their hidden talents and to develop those, and not just this sort of cultural indoctrination. They wanted education to open minds, prepare people for careers, to seek out their talents and to develop them, and these sorts of things. A very different approach to the educational system as well. And so progressivism managed to do all of these things, but it does come with some downsides. It does have a darker side to it. And one of the things that you see working in the milieu progressivism are the same kind of political philosophies that had attached themselves to the labor movement. So you see anarchism, you see socialism, you see communism, you see Marxism. All of these things, can put on the progressive hat and take advantage of the momentum of the progressive movement. The other thing, of course, is that you begin to put layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy in government on every level. And in many ways, this is good because you want engineers to be the people in charge of maintaining roads, and you want trained, people to run fire departments and police departments and hospitals and this sort of stuff. But the experts, of course, also then begin to form a layer that is resistant sometimes to the will of the people. And one of the things that is true in the progressive movement to some extent is that it exalts experts over the common people. It's in that sense, it's kind of an elitist movement that says, hey, the people who've been to the Ivy League colleges are smarter than all of you, and they know better than you what's good for you, and so they're going to dictate to you the way things are going to be, the number of hours you can work, whether stores can be open on Sundays. We can basically dictate to the common people what to do, not by passing laws that can be debated and for which politicians can be rewarded or punished depending on how they vote, but by making rules, by making regulations that are opaque, that people don't get to have a say in, and suddenly they're just there, and they kind of have the force of law, although they're not law, and they're rules and regulations that the legislature may have said that this entity, this bureaucracy can create, and now we're going to enforce, but the people never got a say, and the people never got a voice, and the progressives would tell you, well, that's because the people are dumb. The people don't know what's in their own best interest. The people need to do, in essence, what their betters tell them to do, and it's kind of interesting that this is the kind of thing that a lot of Americans rebelled against in the Revolution, that the aristocracy of England, born into power, born into nobility, born into prestige, born to the right to govern, were basically able to dictate to Americans all sorts of things that they could or couldn't do. And there was a haughtiness and there was an arrogance to it that Americans had ultimately rebelled against. And now some of that stuff begins to happen as a result of what the progressives are doing. And the flip side of the coin, you certainly want somebody who knows something about chemistry to run the sanitation department and to keep the water pure in your society. But, at the same time, you don't want to be dictated to by a bunch of bureaucrats. You don't want to be told how to live your life, how to use your land, how to use your property by somebody that you can't vote for, that you didn't elect, that you can't unelect. And these bureaucracies, of course, can and do outlive political office holders. And so if they like what the elected person is trying to do, then they can support it. And if they don't, that they can drag their feet. They can make it harder. They can resist it, which, of course, circumvents the will of the people. So this is, again, one of these things that has a good side and one of these things that has a bad side. The idea that the people are now going to be dictated to by experts, by the educated elite, is in some ways fundamentally undemocratic, and it can certainly become that way if it's pushed too hard, if the experts begin to believe that they do not have to listen to the will of the people whatsoever. There will be a backlash against that kind of attitude. And the other thing about progressivism is that this idea of making a better world, is certainly laudable. It's something that most progressives believed in, that people want to support. I mean, when you think about it, who wouldn't want a better, fair, safer, more just, more efficient society? But the devil is always in the details, right? So if I said, hey, who among you is in favor of freedom of speech? Well, I think everybody's hand would go up. Everybody would say I'm in favor of freedom of speech. But then when we try and define freedom of speech, then we're going to start to have an argument, right? Because if I said, well, freedom of speech means that you can say anything that you want, even if other people don't like it, even if other people consider it to be hateful or people consider it to be racist or sexist or something like that. Freedom of speech is just that, freedom of speech. You are not free from the consequences of your speech. People can decide not to like you, not to do business with you, not to vote you, not to date you, but you have the right to say what you want. And other people would say, oh no, freedom of speech doesn't allow you to say hateful things, racist things, bigoted things, sexist things. Well, at that point, arguably, you don't have freedom of speech anymore, and you can ask the question, well, who gets to decide what is acceptable speech and what is unacceptable speech? Who gets to make that decision? How do they get chosen? How do they get that power? And is there any way to push back against that if it's inconsistent or it's hypocritical or it's unfair? So freedom of speech, big idea, everybody likes it. We start to get specific, and you'll begin to find out that there are people who have very different ideas on what the freedom of speech means. And the progressives, some of them, tilted toward this idea that if we're going to have a better society, then the mass of people, we're going to have to start being dictated to. They're going to have to be told and forced to live and act and work a certain way. You can't just allow the uneducated and the unwashed masses to do as they wish. You can't rely on the electoral process, because the electoral process through debate and ballot box and voting in legislative chambers can derail things that ought to happen, the good things we know should be done, the good policies that ought to be implemented. And so let's get away from this awkward, outdated thing called the Constitution and democracy, and put all the power in the hands of government and the experts in the government to regulate and to dictate to the people for their own good, and another thing that some people in progressivism dabbled with, or improving the human species itself. So if you believe in the scientific method, you believe science can make things better, well, racism, by modern standards, what would be considered racism, could be just as much a part of progressivism as anything else. Remember, progressives don't have one set list of things that they believe in and stand for. Progressives are attacking different evils and different problems on every level of society, and they're putting the emphasis in different places, and what one progressive thinks is good, another progressive might not necessarily think is good. So if you want a more efficient society, you want a better world, then maybe you want to solve certain problems by developing a superior human being. A superior human being who was not in favor of doing what a progressive expert might consider to be unhealthy things or improper things or immoral things and that kind of stuff. And so, some progressives argued for and actually managed to undertake the sterilization of Native American women because, well, they figured, well, here is an inferior race that really needs to go away. We've tried everything that we could do to bring them into the modern world, and it's just not working, so maybe they just sort of need to be erased from society. Margaret Sanger was a progressive who really advocated abortion, especially amongst blacks, because here was a way to reduce this segment of society that was not particularly desirable. And there's a little bit, all of that is, of course, a little bit of a simplification, but here's the tendency. If you believe in the power of experts, if you believe in the power of science, those things are not inherently good, or they're not inherently bad. They can be manipulated by human beings for good purposes, and they can be manipulated for bad purposes. And if you like the idea of creating a super race, of perfecting humanity in the way that you perfect the light bulb or the phonograph player or something like that, then maybe we should use all of this new science to weed out the weak and the undesirable and have left behind what we consider to be the proper kind of people. And if you give more and more power to government and you give more and more power to experts and that kind of thing, then that is one of the dangers that potentially lurks out there. Some people would argue that that the power that you give to the experts, the power that you give to the government, can be manipulated in a way that is, inherently evil or bad. And nobody, of course, is setting out thinking that, trying to do that or that kind of stuff. And it's certainly, this was a minority part of what the progressive movement was, but it's to say that there was a flip side to every coin. A lot of what the progressives did, a lot of what they fought for was commendable, laudable, and it was successful to make government more responsive, to push back on corruption, to try to improve living conditions for the people in the slums and working conditions for the people in the factories, to make education something that was more than just rote memorization, to really work to make life safer and better. And in many ways, the progressives succeeded. Courtesy of the progressives, sanitation departments and water departments and police departments and fire departments and hospitals, all those things are run better. They're run more efficiently. They're run more scientifically. And that's the kind of world that most Americans wanted, and the reason they supported the progressive movement. But it's not to say that progressivism was successful everywhere. Like most big reform movements, it's going to burn itself out. It's going to get left behind by time, and it's going to be shoved off to the side by other events, and it will have some dark undersides to it for people who are perhaps willing to take it too far, people who are perhaps willing to manipulate the movement and the process for their own narrow purposes. By and large, it is considered historically to be a good thing, part of turning the new industrial urban America into a better place for everyone who inhabited it, although most assuredly not a perfect place by any stretch of the imagination for everybody who inhabited the work. In other words, of building a better world is never done. It is a perpetual task for humanity, as the progressives themselves would have probably been willing to have told you. So that is a broad overview of the progressive movement. As I said, the progressivism, we're going to talk about it more when we get into the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt. We're going to see how it's actually implemented, how a lot of these things are actually done on a national level through a political process, because more and more progressives are going to come to realize that the only way that they're going to achieve a lot of their goals is through political action, by getting laws passed, by getting people elected. So that brings us to the end of chapter 22, this very broad overlook. And so now the first of your 5 questions for the second test. So this will be numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And remember, you want to put these in a Word document. You want to write out the question and then give me your answer. Okay, so question number 1, what constitutional amendment gave the U.S. government the power to establish prohibition? What constitutional amendment gave the U.S. government the power to establish prohibition? That's number 1. Question number 2, what constitutional amendment provides for the direct election of U.S. senators? Question number 2, what constitutional amendment provides for the direct election of United States senators? Question number 3, what constitutional amendment gives women the right to vote? Question number 3, what constitutional amendment gives women the right to vote? Question number 4, what is the name given to the style of journalism that helped ignite the progressive movement? What is the name given to the style of journalism that helped to ignite the progressive movement? And finally, question number 5, this process allows voters to directly approve or reject legislation. This process allows voters to directly approve or reject legislation. So those are your 5 questions. Begin to assemble those into a document. When we get together next time, chapter 23, we're going to go diving back into national politics and look at the assassination of a president and the surprised presidency, the very profoundly important presidency of Spanish-American war hero Theodore Roosevelt. And I look forward to seeing you on our next lecture.